Bom dia ao nosso último evento da série da Fundação Getúlio Vargas. Estamos olhando para o mundo para encontrar bons modelos. Esta é a série Reforma Tributária. O que podemos aprender com a experiência internacional do Imposto sobre Valor Agregado, aqui no Brasil chamado IBS, do Núcleo de Estudos Fiscais da Fundação Getúlio Vargas. Hoje trataremos desse difícil tema que é projetar economicamente qual vai ser a alíquota, como vai ser a implantação do imposto. Meu nome é Eurico De Santi, eu sou professor da Escola de Direito da Fundação Getúlio Vargas, onde tenho a honra de dividir a minha coordenação com o professor Isaías Coelho, que infelizmente hoje não pôde estar presente. Vale salientar que as opiniões expressas neste evento não se confundem com as posições institucionais da Fundação Getúlio Vargas. Além disso, os presentes concordam em participar deste evento, que ficará disponível posteriormente nos canais oficiais da FGV. O evento de hoje é também coordenado pela minha querida amiga Melina Rocha, que está aqui do meu lado. Bom dia, Melina! Bom dia, Melina. Último evento, Melina.
Bom dia a todos.
Melina Rocha, e também que é professora da York University, e pela santa professora Rita Della Féria, padroeira da Reforma Tributária do Brasil, que é também professora catedrática da Universidade de Leeds, no Reino Unido. Bom dia, Rita. O evento de hoje, de 30/7 de hoje, nosso último evento, vai ser, os palestrantes serão o Pierre Pascal Gendron. Bem-vindo, Pierre. E a Rita, que também vai ser debatedora, e o Cornelius Fleischhacker. Cadê o Cornelius?
Olá.
É aqui.
Obrigado.
Salve, Cornelius. Bom, passo imediatamente a minha querida amiga Melina Rocha, para que faça as devidas apresentações dos nossos convidados e apresente também a Bárbara Mengardo como mediadora do nosso evento. Temos aqui também presente a nossa coordenadora executiva do Núcleo de Estudos Fiscais, a professora Lina Santin. Bom dia, Lina.
Bom dia a todos.
Melina, é com você.
Bom, então é com grande alegria que eu apresento o nosso último palestrante dessa série, que teve mais de 1.100 inscritos no total, foi um grande sucesso. Nós estamos muito contentes e orgulhosos dessa série que eu tive a felicidade de coordenar com os professores Eurico, Isaías, professora Rita, e eu agradeço a todos os co-organizadores, porque foi um trabalho de equipe fantástico, uma sinergia, uma energia positiva na organização, que acredito que tenha refletido no resultado final de todas as sessões desse evento. E hoje, para fechar então com chave de ouro, nós vamos ter a honra de receber a apresentação do professor Pierre Pascal Gendron. O professor Pierre Pascal é professor e coordenador do Programa de Negócios Internacionais da Faculdade de Negócios e Instituto de Desenvolvimento Internacional da Humber Institute of Technology and Advanced Learning, aqui em Toronto. Ele é PhD em Economia pela Universidade de Toronto, tem mestrado pela Queen's University e bacharelado pela Universidade de Montreal. O professor Pierre Pascal, ele trabalhou por muitos anos como economista-chefe aqui na KPMG Toronto, mas ele tem igualmente, né, ele tem um extenso currículo de participação em projetos de consultoria e de assistência pelo FMI em todo o mundo. Então, ele já deu assistência em países da Europa, como a Bósnia e Herzegovina, Albânia, Noruega, em países da Ásia e do Oriente Médio, como Sri Lanka, Paquistão, o Kuwait, na África, Líbano, Congo, Senegal, e na América Central e América do Sul, tanto que o professor Pierre Pascal sabe, entende espanhol, português, Ele já deu a consultoria aqui nas Américas, na Bermudas, Belize, Suriname, Guiana, Barbados, Santa Lúcia, e também no Brasil, em 2008, ele teve uma missão para ajudar na reforma tributária do Brasil. E por conta dessa participação extensa, principalmente em países em desenvolvimento, em períodos de transição, né? O professor Pierre Pascal, ele tem um livro que é super famoso, escrito com o professor Richard Burt, que é o livro The VAT in Developing and Transitional Countries, né? Que foi publicado pela Cambridge University Press em 2007 e teve um relançamento em 2011, uma nova edição em 2011, desculpa. Esse livro é uma referência para quem estuda VAT, principalmente VAT aplicado em países em desenvolvimento. Além disso, ele tem uma extensa lista de artigos, de capítulos, escreve muito sobre VAT, experiência internacional de VAT, ele tem artigos excelentes, relatando, analisando a experiência do IVA canadense, do IVA dual canadense. Tem um paper excelente também, que a gente discutiu em uma reunião aqui da FGV, sobre serviços financeiros, e também sobre técnicas de distribuição de produto de arrecadação do VAT, né? Como fazer essa redistribuição entre os entes subnacionais. Mas, além desses temas, o professor Pierre Pascal tem uma lista extensa de publicações. Muito obrigada pela presença, professor. Eu só vou apresentar os nossos debatedores antes de passar a palavra para o senhor. Para comentar o paper, a gente tem, então, a nossa professora Rita de la Féria, padroeira da nossa reforma tributária, que dispensa qualquer apresentação, mas eu vou, para quem está nos acompanhando só nessa sessão, eu vou apresentá-la rapidamente. Ela é professora da Universidade de Leeds, igualmente consultora internacional de diversos países, que assessorou a implementação, não só a implementação, mas como drafting, legal drafting, né? Escrever a legislação de IVA de diversos países, e é também uma referência mundial, né, europeia, de IVA, com diversas publicações e participação internacional. E, por fim, a gente tem Cornelius Fleischhacker, que é economista do Banco Mundial, que é especializado no Brasil e em outros países latino-americanos. Nós tivemos a honra de ter o Cornelius, eu acho que nos últimos 3 anos, você ficou no Brasil, 3 ou 4, Cornelius, 3 anos, em Brasília, nos assessorando e analisando a perspectiva brasileira. Eu acho que também o Cornelius vai deixar o Brasil esse ano, então é com muita alegria que a gente o recebe aqui, justamente para fechar essa sua missão no Brasil, num evento aqui conosco. Também o Cornelius tem experiência pelo FMI no Oriente Médio, na Ásia Central, e ele tem bacharelado na Universidade de Dresden, um mestrado na Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, e também está terminando seu doutorado nessa mesma instituição. Muito obrigada a todos. Passo a palavra novamente para a Bárbara, que vai fazer a intermediação do nosso evento. Obrigada.
Obrigada, Melina. Bom dia, meu nome é Bárbara Mengardo, eu sou jornalista, editora de tributos do Jota. Gostaria, de novo, de agradecer muito a oportunidade de estar aqui. Eu acho que hoje a gente está aqui no último dia de evento. No primeiro dia eu falei o quanto que nós da imprensa ganhamos, né, com essa interlocução com a academia, e tem sido muito proveitoso. Queria aqui publicamente agradecer do fundo do meu coração o Eurico, a Rita, a Melina, a Alina, o professor Isaías, porque tem sido uma oportunidade incrível para mim fazer as mediações desse evento. Eu tenho aprendido muito. Muito obrigada, de verdade. Bom, os dois recadinhos de sempre. Primeiro, esse evento conta com tradução simultânea. Então, se você quer ouvir a tradução para o português ou para o inglês, clique em Interpretation, aqui embaixo, e escolha a língua, ou se você quer ouvir as partes em português e as partes em inglês, é só clicar em off. Outra coisa, quem quiser fazer alguma pergunta, pode mandar pelo Q&A, que também fica aqui nessa barrinha aqui embaixo, que a gente vai fazer, a gente sempre seleciona algumas perguntas para poder fazer. Então, sem demorar mais, gostaria de passar a palavra para o professor Pierre Pascal Gendron.
Bom dia a todos. First, let me please thank a few people before we get started. I would like to first thank Professor Melina for the organization and her kind invitation, and also for the generous introduction at the beginning. Also, Professors Eurico, Rita, and Isaias for their intellectual leadership on this and the organization of the overall event, as well as the foundation and the Núcleo de Estudos Fiscais for hosting the program. And in my experience, this is not a first. We visited Brazil in 2006 under the auspices of the Forum of Federations with a co-sponsorship with the Fiscal Forum of Brazilian States. And in fact, the Fernando Rezende and the foundation in Brasilia hosted us for that event. So this is not just a continuation of this, this collaboration, but it has been a while. And I also want to thank Rita and Cornelius for acting as discussants today. They got my paper rather late, and it's a long paper. And I want to point out this is joint work with Professor Richard Bird from University of Toronto. So, as I mentioned, we had a visit in Brazil in 2006 to talk about the Canadian experience in fiscal federalism and taxation. In 2008, there was a second event sponsored by the World Bank, the Poverty Reduction and Economic Management Group. We did a presentation with other Canadian experts in the Senate building in Brasilia. And of course, after that, the political situation changed and the VAT, I believe at the time, there were two competing VAT proposals in Congress, and then things slid. There's an election, and then, I don't know, a long void. And my sponsor at the bank actually got mutated from Brasilia to Burkina Faso. So that's quite a change for him. So just a couple of remarks about before starting the presentation. Today, the contribution of today's paper is mainly methodological, and I will get to Brazil a little bit later, so that will take a bit of patience. So it will not directly address some of the burning questions that have come on the floor yesterday. In the last couple of days, we're discussing those things. But of course, some questions will come up, and I think the discussion and debate will be a good forum to bring those questions in the context of the VAT Gap methodology and how it can apply to Brazil. Okay, so as you'll see, I have a fairly long presentation. So what I would propose to do there is to move through this presentation quite briskly, and then stay more or less on time to give time to my discussants and for questions afterwards, so that we don't run over too much. So I hope this works for everyone. Okay, so now let me please share my screen. Okay, so let's get going. So this is the outline for today's presentation. Quick intro, talk about VAT revenue and the relationship to the gap, how they fit together. Move to issues of measurement and estimation of VAT gaps. Then talk about interpretations, limitations, and opportunities that are presented by gap analysis. And then I think the situation, the ongoing reform discussions in Brazil will fit nicely with the discussion of the implications for tax policy and administration, the implications of VAT gap analysis. And then I put a surprise epilogue here, hoping we have time to go back to something that was discussed during the last session with Arthur Swistak, and I thought I wanted to get back to that because this is actually related to our discussion today, and it's a controversial issue, so please bear with me for that. Okay, so, I mean, obviously, the current environment is an interesting incubator for a lot of changes, and the fact that Brazil is undergoing those discussions is a very, very fortuitous and timely situation. I think given the extraordinary expenditures caused by the COVID environment and the post-COVID transition, I think all countries will need revenues to fund this. I know the government of Canada has had extraordinary large budget deficits in the progress because of that. So what does that mean in the short term for governments is, number one, getting more revenue out of existing taxes. And if there are opportunities to do better and to have new taxes, like the situation in Brazil, is to focus on broad-based taxes, which usually work better in many respects, and reminding everyone that the VAT is a major revenue producer throughout the world, and that's obviously a very good reform to contemplate. Okay, so before we get into more technical issues of VAT, I think the first thing to say is that the only goal of a VAT is to raise revenue efficiently. The VAT has been used, or there have been attempts to use the value-added tax to do a lot of other things, and price control, protection, conferring social benefits through tax expenditures. All those things the VAT doesn't do very well, if at all. In fact, what the VAT does is raise a significant amount of revenue in a fairly efficient way, economically speaking. So I think the starting point for the interest in VAT is looking at cross-country experience and trying to understand the relative revenue performance measure of the VAT. And a lot of indicators have been presented in the past. We have obviously VAT revenues realized to total tax revenues, VAT revenues to consumption, since VAT is a consumption tax. That's a repetition here. Is VAT buoyancy and VAT elasticity. VAT buoyancy is the evolution of how well the evolution of VAT revenues tracks the changes in GDP. So that's the ratio of the percentage change of VAT revenue to the percentage change in GDP. So this tracks how well GDP, value-added tax revenues will track GDP growth or contraction. And then another indirect measure, which is more big picture, is considering the tax expenditures that are conferred through the value-added tax system. So this is the cost of social or policy measures in terms of foregone tax revenues. In Canada, for example, we have a major one. We have the zero rating of basic foods, right? So this is a large VAT tax expenditure, and that's computed. It's accounted as an expenditure through the tax system. Okay, so those are some of the basic measures. So VAT revenues to GDP. This was the one here that was quite important. That's kind of the standard everybody looks at. So here we have a little graph, a little tight, but that's the relative importance of VAT as a source of revenue in 2019 by large economic regions. So the gray bars show us the VAT as percentage of revenues. The red bars show us percentage of GDP, and the gray bar, the blue bar is revenue as a percentage of GDP. So there's quite a little bit of variation, but I think when you consider the remainder of the tax system, especially income taxes, you see that the VAT is a fairly important revenue generator throughout the world, but with very, very, very different contributions. The first thing, when you look at a diagram like this, the first thing not to do is to try to infer causality patterns as to level of development and ability to tax. I think the story is a little bit more complicated than that. And usually this is why data such as those are really our starting point. We need to go a little bit further with this. Okay, so let's do that. So again, it's all about tax revenues. And there are two sides to the revenue picture. And now I'm going to assume a situation where a country has a VAT that's up and running, that's operational. So on one side, there's the realized revenue, the revenue that the VAT system is actually generating for the Treasury. And then the other side is the potential revenue, which is a bit more of a complex story. It's, if all went well, how much revenue could the VAT raise in theory if the policy design were really clean, if compliance were good or perfect. So that's the idea of potential. So it's comparing what the VAT could raise as opposed to what the VAT actually raises in revenue. So as a VAT joke, the rest aside from the revenue and the potential and realize, the rest here is just details. Okay, so in order to move this debate a little bit further, the International Monetary Fund came up with an indicator, a very clever indicator that we call C efficiency, and the OECD has a similar measure as well, as what we would call a revenue efficiency indicator. So let me just present the ratio. This is something that has been used a lot, and it's worthwhile discussing it. So in this equation here, the variable EC is what we call the C efficiency ratio. On the numerator, we have the VAT revenue, that's the actual VAT revenue. On the denominator, we have the product of the standard VAT rate and consumption at VAT at tax exclusive prices. Okay, so this tells us, a number of things, but it tells us how much revenue is actually raised as a percentage of the possible theoretical revenue that you would raise if you apply the standard VAT rate to the entire consumption in the economy. Okay, so in theory, the ratio is bounded by 0 and 1, but as we'll see in a minute, there are possibilities to exceed 1 in some cases, but in theory, this is between 0 and 1, that efficiency indicator. So this is a bit of a tight table, but this table shows, this is all in the report, but it shows the evolution over time of standard VAT rates in OECD countries. And the last column is the equivalent of the C efficiency VAT revenue ratio. So what you see there is just scrolling down the list of countries, usually, 60%, 47%, 45, 65, 72. There's an outlier at 1.04 in New Zealand, which is in practice the most perfect VAT according to experts. But what the story to take out of this is there's a large share of consumption that is not taxed under VAT for a variety of reasons. So if anything, this is an important lesson from the C efficiency ratio. So the message there is that the VAT could probably raise more revenue if we wanted to. Okay, so the indicator is easy to calculate. It's based on easily available information. So it has been used a lot in cross-country comparisons. But there are limits to this. First of all the elements there over time, you would think, are interdependent. So we can't treat this as an exogenous indicator of VAT revenue performance. We need to do a bit more, and especially try to understand the behavior of C efficiency over time, explain why C efficiency changes in some countries and what causes those changes. So the idea of the VAT gap analysis is to actually, rather than focus on cross-country comparisons, is to actually look inside the VAT itself at the country level to try to understand departures from the ideal of 100% C efficiency. So the two concepts that we have here helping us define this a bit further are the policy gap and the compliance gap. Okay, so those are the two. If you think at one block here as the total VAT gap, it's made up of two components. One part of it is the policy gap, the other part is the compliance gap. Okay, so let's define those important terms. So the policy gap essentially indicates the revenue that is not collected because of design features that depart from, if you like, a perfect VAT that would impose a uniform tax rate on all consumptions without any exemptions and without any input taxation, right? And so that's zero. That policy gap would be exactly zero if the VAT applied at a single rate on all consumption, and the rate also play a role in this if there are multiple VAT rates that will affect the policy gap. So In current frameworks, the IMF for a long time has advised countries to estimate tax expenditures. So that would separate tax expenditure estimations for the value-added tax would give us a pretty good indication of the policy gap by calculating the revenue foregone of policy measures with respect to a reference VAT system, keeping in mind that some things cannot be taxed anyway, like pure public goods and so on. Now, the trickier part really is the compliance gap, and that's where the challenges lie for today. That reflects, that's the gap in revenue, that's the departure from C efficiency that is due to the imperfect implementation and operation of the VAT. So that would be equal to 0 if the full potential revenue from applying the statutory VAT rate, let's assume a single rate, to the statutory base would be realized. Okay, that's an ideal, that's a bit of a fantasy, but that's a really good benchmark to move the VAT forward. Okay, so let's say a little bit more about what's inside those gaps. So the policy gap can also be decomposed into two parts, which are very intuitive: rate gap and exemption gap. So the rate gap is obviously the part of the gap that's due to having, for example, reduced rates on necessities and essential goods. And the exemption gap is the part of the gap that's due to the fact that exemptions are imposed, so that we're talking, for example, about a final retail exemption. That's the revenue foregone from not taxing the last stage of value added in that sector. So the policy gap itself assumes 100% compliance. That's the benchmark, okay? So you will see a little bit of an asymmetry here between the two. So very important, it assumes 100% compliance. Otherwise, we're into just ballpark analyses. Well, let's assume 80% compliance. That's easy to do, but that's not terribly helpful. So to avoid this kind of manipulation, we assume 100% compliance. And as I said before, that's related to that tax expenditures, policy decisions in terms of revenue foregone. Now, the compliance gap, the tricky part, that's the difference between revenues that are actually collected and the potential revenues that could have been collected. So this one actually takes the existing policy framework as given. So there are exemptions, reduced rates, a threshold that's too low, whatever it is. The calculation of the compliance gap will take that as given under the reasoning that the tax administration has to administer the system as it is designed. There's nothing it can do about improving that design, but it can try to make more effort in collecting revenue given that design. Okay. Now there are two decompositions for that gap, collection and assessment. So the assessment gap gives us the difference between the VAT that's actually collected and the VAT that's been assessed, whereas collection is the gap between what was assessed but not collected by the administration for a number of reasons, like bad debt, unrecoverable arrears, and so on and so forth. So that's, again, a helpful decomposition. You can think of other distinctions if you have a lot of administrative data, but those are pretty good to start. So the good thing about the compliance gap is once the data are out, especially on a multi-year basis, the administration and the government can start focusing on deficiencies in administration, focusing on administrative performance, and also try to pinpoint the economic sector where evasion is more prevalent than others. In Canada, the website of the Canada Revenue Agency and Revenu Quebec, for example, always talk about the same sectors: labor-intensive services, construction services, the restaurant and small hospitality sector. So we know in those cases there is evasion going on, so cash transactions and so on. Okay. So why would we like to do this? I think the context, the broad context, the VAT, and now this is not new. I'm not introducing a new concept I discovered last week. I think there's been a lot of momentum in VAT gap analysis over the last decade, and I think one of the generators of that has been the pressure to generate more revenue more equitably and really understand the potential of the tax system. The second one has been as a tool to benchmark governance, including the quality of fiscal governance, so make cross-country comparisons and VAT gaps, and see which countries do better at ensuring good compliance and so on. Of particular interest for the Brazil discussion is, of course, a good chunk of this analysis can be very helpful to assess the revenue potential of the new tax. Okay, and we'll return to that in a minute. And the information, the outputs here are really useful for tax policy, for the domestic revenue administration, and customs. As Professor Smart was talking about the other day, the contribution of imports to VAT collections is very, very important. And there are a lot of good reasons to keep it good, keep it that way. But again, it's not possible to assume perfect enforcement at customs either, which is a subject for another day, but that's a complicated issue, okay? So we want to measure two things: potential revenue, actual VAT revenue, and then with those two outputs in hand, the relative size of the compliance gap to the policy gap. So, and there are a couple of ways of expressing that. So let's get back to that in a second. So what are the kinds of data inputs that would be needed in a gap analysis? So registry data on taxpayers or the businesses that are registered, tax return data, VAT return data, all data on tax payments, refunds, arrears, bad debts, and so on and so forth. Customs declaration data with the VAT assessed at customs. Input, output, or source use tables to see, measure at the sectoral level the value added, okay? And helpfully, the household expenditure survey as well is quite helpful, okay? Here's a little summary of the two main approaches, and I'll just describe in a second in a bit more detail. I think this could have been in a better place, but under the top-down approach, we use the data that are available at the overall economy level: macro, national accounts, input-output tables, large surveys like expenditure surveys, and we try to drill down a little bit at the sectoral level. Okay, so that's the dominant approach. The reverse approach is to start from the bottom, is to start from information that the operation of the VAT system produces in the course of its normal activities, and work the way up to try to understand, for example, if one had the entire taxpayer registry with VAT returns, you could do simulations, micro simulations on that to calculate the VAT that was foregone from exemptions. So that's a different approach because it's using different data, and in an ideal world, a combination of the two would be ideal. Now, the bottom-up approach is time-consuming, is more sensitive on data. The top-down approach is more efficient and has become the dominant approach to ensure comparability between methodologies in different countries. So let's, okay, so just to recap, top-down starts with macro aggregates and then drills down a little bit. And of course, in that case, we need all the information about, different VAT rates, the exemptions at the commodity level or the sectoral level, and any special treatment, domestic zero rating, and so on. Bottom up, tax admin data on all the key activities: registration, filing, payment, enforcement, and audit, and move the analysis up a little bit, okay? So bottom up, because of its relative simplicity and data availability, has become the dominant approach, and top-down, pardon me. And in that case, bottom-up can serve as a very, very useful validation, but it's rarely used as a standalone method, although in technical assistance missions, because of time constraints, I have had to do a bottom-up analysis on my own, and it's a lot of fun. So there are two variants of the dominant approach, the top-down approach. Number one is the case reports for the European Commission. And secondly, the IMF's Revenue Administration GAP program. One very desirable feature those two approaches share is that they are based on multi-year estimation. This is especially true of the case reports, which began, the embryon of this was 2009, the Recon report, and picking up in 2013, I believe they've run estimates every day for the EU 28 countries. That's for the last report. The Revenue Administration Gap program is more a technical assistance program, but there are situations where some countries have run the estimation over multiple years. So every year the updates require the availability of data collection numbers to update the approach using the models and so on, and incorporate any changes in the economy. So the multi-year is very desirable because remember, the C efficiency is a limited indicator in the sense that we don't have a lot of tools to understand C efficiency's evolution over time just by looking at the numbers at the cross-country level every year. That's where the tax gap analysis becomes useful because we can actually calculate the two different gaps and understand which one contributes the most to the decline in C efficiency. So the case approach is what we call, it's a consumption side approach. So it starts from the idea of final consumption as being our ideal base here, and make adjustments for non-deductible VAT imposed on sectors that are not taxed, that don't have a final output that is taxed, and any non-taxable sectors. So it's a consumption side approach. The IMF's RA gap is completely different. This I gave it the name the value-added approach because what this does is estimate the amount of VAT at the sectoral level using value-added, the difference between taxable output and taxable inputs, by making adjustments at the sectoral level for any different rates, any different exemptions, the fact that less than 100% of businesses are registered and so on. So the key piece of information here is input-output tables or supply-use tables, sometimes they're called. That's very important. And again, the exemptions are handled at the sectoral or commodity level as well, depending on the detail involved in the input-output tables. So that's quite a different approach. But you know, this looks like two different worlds, but in fact, one useful exercise that has been done, a lot of researchers have actually compared how the estimates for similar countries track themselves. And in general, those two approaches give fairly consistent answers if you track over time. So, and it's logical because it's just following a number of identities in the economy, starting with national accounts in all cases, except that here we're breaking down the GDP by sectors and the value added by sector. Okay. There have been other top-down estimates. They're discussed in the paper, but I should acknowledge that the World Bank has done punctual studies on the VAT gap, and also the Inter-American Center of Tax Administrations has a very interesting study dating from 2017 that compares VAT gap in Latin American, although they use a top-down approach, but it's quite different than the two I described. So we'll leave this aside for now, but it's a study that's cited in the report, and I encourage everyone in Brazil to take a good look. That's a very, very interesting study. So let us look at some numbers now. So what are the limitations? Before we show some figures, what are the limitations? So the model, and how do we interpret the VAT gap estimate? So this model produces a monetary measure of the compliance gap. That's a starting point. That's the focus of the thing. The policy gap will be our residual. I didn't show the formula, but there's a way to look at the impact of the policy gap. But here we take the policy gap as given, and it's a clearer one conceptually to express. So the compliance gap, gamma, should be actually a relative number. The monetary figures mean nothing because we're talking about countries of different scales and so on, different GDP. So one way to express this is to subtract actual collections from current potential revenues and divide that by current potential revenues. So this would give us the percentage gap, you know, that compliance gap, 10%, 15%, 20%, and so on. Okay. So let's look at some numbers. Those are the outputs from the last European report by case, all figures in million. So comparative figures for 16 and 17. Now, the last column here, the VAT gap, the compliance gap in percentage, that's really the column. So what you see there is an average for the EU 28 in 2016 of 12.2 and 11.2. Now, previous reports would give us the entire time series for that, but that's interesting because now this asks the question, okay, you look at EU 28, why did the gap decline? So you can start tying this up to changes in general economic conditions and so on, and that's where econometric analyses can come in handy. But what's really interesting there is the wild variation in the figures. Let's look at 2017. We have, for example, let's look here at a very small number. Cyprus, 0.6%. I don't know about that. 0.6% in Cyprus, and then Romania, 36%. So, okay, so you have those cross-country comparisons, same point in time, same data, same annual data. So now you can start thinking, why is Romania, why is the compliance gap in Romania so large compared to the median country, which is, I didn't show the median, it's a little bit smaller than 11.2%. So those comparisons start inviting questions, which is the whole purpose of the thing. And again, keeping in mind the methodology is uniform and we have multiple year data. So this is a very desirable exercise. Now, this is the policy gap. I'll go quickly because our time is flying here. Policy gap, right? Belgium, 52%. And this breaks down in rate gap and exemption gap. So this is for all the countries. So we have the policy gap. And as I said, that's a residual gap after the compliance gap has been calculated. Okay. So that's the case report does this after compliance gap is calculated. Now, I apologize, this is a bit too tight, but this is the output from the RA gap. Again, this is a small subset of the RA gap analysis. Those are the countries, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Jamaica, and so on, for which the countries that have given authorization to the IMF to publicly release the data. So we have multi-year data. And again, the data are expressed differently. I mean, to an economist, this is a bit more fun to look at because we have compliance gap, policy gap as percentage of GDP. We have same numbers as percentage of potential VAT revenue. Now we have the collection gap as percentage of GDP revenue and percentage of the gap itself. So the data are a little bit more detailed, but keep in mind the IMF has a big trove of other data for other countries that have not allowed the data to be released. So this is a long-standing program as well with a very rich history of data. So obviously there are limitations. You need data. Out-of-date input-output tables or surveys make the analysis less reliable, although it's better to do it than not. Sometimes we have inconsistent definitions of economic sectors between the national accounts and the tax return classifications. Adjustments could be difficult. We might have insufficient information systems, although this problem is getting better over time. And if we're unable, the next to last one is quite important. The most value that can be obtained there is by producing annual estimates and update and maintain the models to do this. So if we do this as a one-shot, it's helpful, but then we can't track performance over time. Now, bottom-up approach validation is great to have. That's not critical. I think low-income developing countries can do a very useful VAT gap analysis without spending a minute on that, although a lot of the information that you need for the top-down approach will actually have to be collected from the services that give us the bottom-up approach data, the top-down approach, bottom-up approach data. So that's, it's not a big point. So we need estimates better than having none. I think the good thing about VAT gap estimates is they really refocus the discussion on revenues instead of rates and exemptions and preferential treatments. They really improve transparency and policy objectives and possibly provide some buy-in for improving resources for the administration. Again, emphasis at the country level, and I think it's fair to say that good policy decisions are often seen as more important because they can be made a little bit more quickly in some cases, whereas improving tax administration is sometimes a medium-term to long-term project, and especially improving the perception of the tax administration, the tax morale. This is all very, very hard work. So compliance is a complex phenomenon, and it's not just due to bad design. Okay. The key thing here for VAT administration, I think those are the key takeaways, is that the sectoral analysis gives us an indication of the areas that require improvements. Which economic sectors have the lowest compliance? Where do we think evasion happens? So this is very helpful for resource allocation. And then it can also identify the kinds of policy reforms that would help administration the most. Like, for example, in an ideal world, how would you deal with the cash construction sector in a country like Canada? What can you do to improve compliance in that sector? So that's a kind of question that can be raised with the gap analysis. Okay, now another thing, this is more for the long run, and now we're going to start talking about Brazil. So those methodologies are available for the other core taxes and excises as well. So the good thing in the longer term of considering the gap analysis for other taxes is that it takes pressure off the VAT. And the problem with the VAT, especially with a reform that focuses on only that, is the rest of the tax system and the expenditure system are going to the background. And that's an enormous problem, because now all of a sudden the VAT takes on the burden of doing a lot of things, raising a lot of revenue, not screwing some sectors, helping with allocation of revenue, and so on and so forth. So looking at other taxes opens up discussion of the ideal tax mix, and that's something that differs by country. Just to let you know, UK and Canada has done some work. I've done some work on those, and in the report there are some references on Canada for that. They've done all the taxes, the Canada Revenue Agency. So how does that apply to Brazil now or later? So the new VAT system is not up and running. So in a way, one half of the VAT gap analysis is not available to us. There's no compliance experience, so we cannot calculate the compliance gap. We don't have actual data to compare to potential data. Can we still use the methodology? Yes, we can actually estimate potential revenue. We can, first of all, simulate different policy gaps based on different assumptions for exemptions, registration threshold, zero rating, and any major departures like microsystems, Archer called, which I really like the term, micro VAT systems for separate sectors, for example, the treatment of agricultural sector, agri-food business. So that part can be used to estimate the policy gaps, again, using sectoral information and making assumptions about that. Now, the other advantage of doing this, and Brazil, I'm certain, has all the information to do it, is to validate the existing revenue projections that underlie the CBS and IBS proposals that are now on the table, and possibly other proposals. And what do we have to do about the compliance gap? Well, wait for at least a full year of collections to actually run the analysis and now look at the potential versus actual revenue, keeping in mind that the compliance gap requires a complete conversion of cash collections into accrual collections, okay? So when money is actually due. So this is the end of the formal part. I just wanted to say 2 words in my epilogue. And financial services. The financial services debate really illustrates the problem of not being fully clear about the base. So the debate now has spent a lot of time on the 5.9% rate, and that's a really, really, really bad avenue to enter. This is one of the most complex economic sectors. It has received the most absurd VAT treatment in many, many countries. And without knowing exactly what the base is, those numbers mean absolutely nothing. So my colleague Archer yesterday made a very, very pertinent remark saying that is the 5.9% rate on a cumulative basis the right rate? No idea. You have to know what the numbers are, and that's actually a really difficult analysis. So it's a number that requires a deep technical analysis to understand. And once a number like this is unleashed in the media, there's no turning back. So this is very, very difficult, this kind of path. So the question I would ask as an economist, not seeing the models that have been used to arrive, is, as the Ministry of Finance or the sponsors of those proposals looked at all the options, for example, applying the standard rate to all fee-based financial services and use an allocation key to calculate the input VAT that would be creditable on the activities of fee-based services. And then the rest is exempt, so all inputs allocated to the financial intermediation services that deliver exempt outputs, that would not be creditable. So in the short term, that's doable. And in fact, a good number of countries are doing this. South Africa was an early leader there, and it's works pretty well. It just helps the system work better. Second option, which is more a brute force option, is to actually take the financial sector outside the normal credit invoice VAT and use an addition regime where you calculate the value added on an accounts base using wages and profits. That's the value added, and convert the data on a cash flow, not an accounting basis. So again, that's doable. In fact, I've calculated this base once for an Islamic country in Africa that has very significant Islamic finance sector. That's fairly easy to do if the data are available, and the banks usually have the data. Option 3 is to apply the cash flow VAT method with tax calculation account. This is a long-term method, but I would say this method was tested. I was a member of the team in '97 that ran those analyses for the European Commission. It produces the right result. It's a lot of calculation. I think in the mid-90s, the problem with the cash flow VAT method was information systems in Europe in the banking sector were not appropriate to run these kinds of analysis where you calculate VAT due on a cash flow basis with adjustments for the time value of money and accumulation of VAT due and credits. Now, I don't see a barrier for that. I don't know if the EU is looking at it again, but this is a beautiful system and it does work. So, just a couple of closing remarks. The broad exemption of financial services is actually inefficient and regressive. The economists in the room do not like this kind of thing. A lot of the services, a lot of the value added that's foregone there for taxation is actually benefiting medium and high income folks. So this is not a good policy, but it produces a lot of revenue. The Canadian government knows this. That's why they have a very, very complex system to support a very broad exemption with an allocation key for the revenue. So it's input taxation, okay, let's be clear. So I think people should ignore the EU, Canada, and most OECD countries. And you know, the other thing that has happened, there is an incredible waste of intellectual resources that where countries that apply a broad exemption to financial services have used all sorts of gimmicks to support the exemption instead of looking at breaking that down and looking at full taxation. And I think many of those systems are not improvable now, and any new gimmick that comes in complicates that further and increases compliance cost and administration costs. So it's not a winner. Okay, so for further discussion, a couple of articles in the Policy Forum of the Canadian Tax Journal in 2006, as Rita and Richard Ness on the EU financial transaction tax, Michael Keane, Russell, and John, the financial activity, the FAT tax, financial activities tax, IMF, and then an article by myself about the Canadian system. And just keep in mind, the Canadian system is totally paralyzed. There is no interest in doing this. And the Department of Finance does not want to talk about it, but it's really unfortunate. Okay, so Sorry for being a bit over time. So thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And now I would please let my discussants do their work. Thank you.
Muito obrigada, professor. Gostaria de passar a palavra agora para a professora Rita Della Féria.
Obrigada, Bárbara. Primeiro, começar por agradecer ao professor Pedro a facto de vindo aqui hoje, não só a este seminário, também o ter... Conseguem-me ouvir? Sim?
Cortando um pouquinho, mas acho que...
Ok. Vou tentar aproximar-me mais do microfone. Ter o facto de estar aqui, não só neste seminário, mas também o facto de ter participado em todos os seminários, ter um enorme empenho na reforma do Brasil, ouviu todos os seminários desta série, portanto estamos-lhe muito gratas, eu e a Melina, mas também em nome do Eurico e do Isaías, que não estão aqui, o facto de ele ter aceito este convite. Para mim, pessoalmente, é um prazer também, uma honra ser a debatedora do paper dele. Como a Melina referiu, ele é uma referência mundial a nível do IVA. O livro que ele e o Richard Bird escreveram é um dos melhores e um dos mais referenciados livros sobre IVA do mundo inteiro. E, portanto, é uma honra para mim ser a debatedora do paper dele. Nós já não nos vemos pessoalmente há algum tempo. Estávamos a comentar, antes do seminário começar, que a última vez que estivemos juntos em pessoa foi na África do Sul, já há uns 4 anos, talvez, e, portanto, é pena não estarmos mesmo fisicamente no Brasil, melhor se estivéssemos fisicamente no Brasil, mas pelo menos estamos no Brasil virtualmente. Bom, tendo posto isto, vou fazer os meus comentários, se não se importam, em inglês, porque o paper estava em inglês, para mim é mais fácil. A Bárbara há pouco fazia um comentário, é mais fácil, na verdade é mais fácil para mim comentar coisas técnicas que estão em inglês, é mais fácil comentá-las para mim em inglês do que em português. Se estiver em português, o comentário para mim em português é fácil, mas se estiver a ler em inglês é mais fácil fazer o comentário em inglês. Bom, Pierre Pascal, I'm going to make my comments in English now, if that's okay. So thank you so much for the paper. I have a few comments on the paper itself, but before, let me just say about the financial services comments that you made at the end, that the EU is looking again. It started at the end of last year, 2019, looking at this. Again, on the potential reform of VAT treatment of financial services. As you know, I have been a strong supporter of reform in this area at EU level, and I have been pushing for reform in the EU for a long time now. For me, like for you, this is a source of frustration that we keep tinkering at the edges instead of looking at the big picture. And the big picture is that there is no technical reason any longer for the EU to not tax financial services. Okay, so having said that, now to the paper itself, and I have 3 basic comments on the paper. So first of all, on the C efficiency measure, you mention on the paper that one of the limitations is that it uses revenue as an indicator, and because it uses revenue as an indicator and the revenue might be distorted, it's not a good indication of a good VAT, because the revenue could mean that you're taxing things that you shouldn't be taxing, right? And I think this is a very pertinent comment, because I think that this is a general problem with these measurements, because the revenue is not a solid indicator of the quality of the VAT. In general. So you mentioned specific situations of taxing what you shouldn't tax, but I was thinking about other stuff. For example, not giving refunds that we mentioned yesterday. It boosts up your revenue, and it's terrible for the VAT system, right? there is many measures, anti-fraud measures that boost up your revenue, and yet they are actually undermining the functioning of your system. So I think there is flaws with anything that uses the revenue. We have to be careful with what we mean by the revenue. And that leads me to my second comment. At a certain stage in the paper, you mention why have we been using the VAT gap measurement, and you emphasize how we use performance indicators for tax administrations, right? And this leads me to one of my biggest concerns on this story. I fear that there has been a fake boosting of revenues because the performance indicators are driving a maximization revenue to the detriment of the tax system. Now, I have looked at this. I have written a paper recently on these issues, but there is significant literature now that indicates that performance indicators are massive drivers of performance. So they work better than we ever thought that they could work. And this includes in developing countries. For example, there is a very interesting study done, I don't know if you know, in Pakistan, with the tax administration in Pakistan, that indicates that just allowing auditors to choose where they live on the basis of the performance indicators. So if they are good, very good revenue collectors, they can choose to live near their family. Just that boosts up the revenue massively. So there's also studies indicating that the bargaining power for corruption of auditors increases when you include revenue indicators. So in essence, you're giving more bargaining power to corrupt auditors by including performance indicators. So this worries me a lot. Worrying me a lot, I have to say. So I think that this is something that I think you could explore more in the paper, I guess. This link between the VAT gap and the performance indicators. So the fact that we're using this measurement more could be having very negative consequences at other levels of the tax administration. And then my final comment is about how, I mean, you mentioned some limitations on the VAT gap measurement. I know that you were present for Michael Smart's presentation, and Michael and Arthur Swickstack in their paper talk a little bit about how to improve evaluations of fraud, specifically, not generally non-compliance. So I think it would, I guess it'd be nice to integrate your analysis with that paper. But also, I had a student of mine who was doing a dissertation on the VAT gap measurement, who identified a few limitations. And one that you didn't mention, and I think it was actually at the center of her thesis, was the geographical limitation. Her thesis was in essence that there is certain parts of countries that are more susceptible to VAT non-compliance behavior than others, and that the geographic spread of the revenue collection versus the potential consumption should be assessed on a geographical, and that will give you an inkling of what is happening. And her hypothesis, which she couldn't verify, obviously, because she didn't have the detailed data for the various countries, but her hypothesis is that VAT informality is more common in rural areas and in areas where there is close-knitted communities. That was her hypothesis. And the reason was because basically everyone trusts everyone, so no one asks for receipts, etc. And therefore it's easier to not comply. So these are my comments. Thank you again so much for the paper. Queria só dizer mais umas palavras agora em português. Dizer que nós começamos com política tributária, depois falámos de legislação tributária e acabamos os seminários com administração tributária. Eu vou só enfatizar mais este ponto de que, para mim, estes três elementos são simbióticos, estão todos dependentes uns dos outros e não podemos perceber os sistemas tributários sem percebermos estes três elementos. Portanto, política tributária é só um dos elementos. Sem uma boa legislação, sem uma administração tributária que está à altura, e no caso do Brasil isso acontece, está à altura, mas sem uma administração tributária que tem os devidos procedimentos e a cultura certa, sem uma legislação tributária que é boa, as coisas não funcionam, mesmo que a política tributária seja excelente. Portanto, precisamos destas 3 coisas. Eu estou muito contente, e eu sei que a Melina, o Eurico e o Isaías também, de podermos ter coberto estes 3 elementos dos sistemas tributários, todos nestas séries. Começámos com a política, passámos pela legislação, agora acabamos com a administração tributária. E, portanto, queria agradecer mais uma vez, começou já ontem com o Arthur Swaystack e acabamos agora com o Pierre Pascal, o facto de terem vindo falar deste tema tão importante que é a administração tributária. Obrigada e vou passar outra vez à Bárbara.
Obrigada, professora Rita. Gostaria de passar a palavra agora para Cornelius Fleshhiker.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me in this seminar. I'm very honored to be here with all of you, and especially honored to be here with the great scholars of the VAT like Pierre-Pascal Gentron and Rita Della Feria. Since I'm actually not a VAT expert by any stretch. As was mentioned, I'm a country economist covering Brazil for the World Bank. I've been working on Brazil for almost 7 years now, and I'll be sort of leaving the Brazil program very soon. As a country economist, we deal with all macro issues. I've dealt a lot with public finance issues in Brazil at the federal level, as well as at the state government level, which is, of course, in the Brazilian context also, very much linked to the VAT agenda, given that the largest VAT type tax in Brazil by revenue is a state tax rather than a federal tax. I started looking closely at the tax issues in Brazil only over the last 2 years, more or less. We organized a seminar with policymakers in Brasilia a little over a year ago. That's actually where I met Melina for the first time, since she was a presenter there. We had representatives from the Canadian government, from India, from Australia, several experts. Unfortunately, Professor Rita couldn't make it at the time, and Pierre Pascal wasn't there either, but I think in hindsight, his work would have been very relevant there as well. So that being said, I very much enjoyed the paper and the presentation by Pierre Pascal Gentron. I think it was a great paper, especially for somebody like me who's not a long-trained VAT expert. It was a very good introduction to the issue of the VAT gap and the efficiency measurements and the issues associated with them. Just to say that, of course, in the World Bank, there is work being done on VAT gaps as well. Pierre Pascal mentioned some work, mostly using the top-down methodologies, but increasingly also in the bottom-up side, which of course depends on the World Bank getting access to the relevant tax data, usually from the tax revenue authorities. There's a recent case where the World Bank used the bottom-up methodology to estimate the VAT gap for Latvia, which came out at 23%, by the way. Now, I have a few more broader comments on the policy gap especially, and then I wanted to say a few things about Brazil. So the policy gap, I think the paper makes very clear that the policy gap is really gaps that are in the tax system by design, right? It reflects the extent to which the VAT differs from its sort of textbook model, which is a uniform tax on all consumption and only final consumption, without exceptions or rate variations, and of course no sort of indirect or cumulative taxes on production. Now, the interesting aspect, I think, of the policy gap approach is that the policy gap can be what I would call a positive or normal gap, right, which reduces efficiency, but it can also be a negative gap, right, which is a bit of a weird concept, but basically it's just a deviation from this textbook approach, which leads to more collection than there would be in this this hypothetical clean VAT system. Now, the negative gaps, if you want to call them this, they're actually quite common in developing countries. And so that's an issue that I think the World Bank has been dealing with quite a lot. And some of the sort of things that lead to negative gaps have been mentioned, not giving tax VAT revenues when they're due, or, a tax legislation that basically just doesn't accept tax credits on, for example, non-physical inputs into production. That's an issue that's big in Brazil, right? To the extent that VAT credits on inputs are possible, they're usually only on the direct physical inputs that go into the product, not other expenditures that are used for the production of the product. And of course, there is the whole issue of taxation of intermediate goods, cumulative taxation, which I think those who know the Brazilian tax system will be able to think of many examples where this is happening. Now, the paper very rightly notes that a high efficiency, right, a small aggregate policy gap, does not necessarily indicate good performance. Right? That would only be the case if your design and administration is very clean. Now, the problem, of course, is that if you aggregate a bunch of positive gaps that you might have because you have reduced rates for food stuff or other sectors that got a lower rate, and then you have a bunch of negative gaps where you implement cumulative taxation, they can kind of even out, right? So your aggregate number can look like it's great, even though it's just a matter of accumulating a bunch of deviations that fall on different sides. So I think that's a real challenge, and the paper sort of discusses how the policy gap can be disaggregated, and I think that's really very, very important when doing that kind of analysis. Now, on the compliance gap, there's only like 2 points that I wanted to raise, and they're more questions than anything else. The first is there a relationship between the tax rates and the compliance gap? So I think theory would suggest that if you have higher rates, that will lead to more efforts to not comply. So there should be a positive relationship, but can we actually find that empirically? And then the role of informality. Rita already mentioned that, and I think that's very, very important for those of us who work in developing countries, where a lot of production and final consumption sort of goes through the informal sector. I think it's quite obvious that informality contributes to the compliance gap. The numbers that are in the paper sort of suggest at first glance that yes, countries that have a large informal sector, even in the sort of OECD world, that's mostly considered in the paper. Countries like Italy or Greece, or they tend to have a higher compliance gap. But what's the empirical evidence on that? Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about the applicability of all of this to Brazil, because that's, to be honest, what I'm most comfortable at. Now, some of you may have heard of or read a famous book by an Australian author about Brazil, which is called A Death in Brazil, A Book of Omissions. I was thinking about that because in many ways, taxes in Brazil, to me, is a system of gaps, right? Reading about the policy gaps, the Brazilian indirect tax system is just full of them everywhere, right? And that sort of leads me to the question, can we even usefully measure tax gaps in Brazil? And if so, how would we do that? The paper cited another paper which is focused on Latin America by Santiago Diaz de Sarral de Miguez. And they actually have a footnote where they say that in the case of Brazil, the decentralization of consumption taxation at the state level was excessively complicated for the analysis. Now, to me, that's a very polite way of describing it, because, yes, the fact that we have a state VAT and then we have municipal services taxes is a problem, but it's not really the fact of the problem is not that it's at that level. It's that the system is just excessively complicated. There is multiple tax regimes, even within a single tax and within a single state. There is, cumulative aspects. There is special rates. There is, the so-called tax substitution. So, doing that kind of analysis in Brazil in any rate would be very, very difficult, right? So the top-down approach It might be feasible, but I think the gaps are just too many and they go in all sorts of directions. So the aggregate number could very easily become, very non-meaningful. Maybe it could be more meaningful if you do it sort of what was described as the micro VAT system, right? Looking at a specific sector, a specific tax, which then is in a specific state or jurisdiction, applies a specific regime. I think then you can do that at the micro level, and then if you do it well at the micro level, I suppose you can aggregate those sectors up. The bottom-up approach, I think, could be feasible in a similar sense. I think the recetas, right, the revenue services at the various states and at the federal level, they know their taxpayers quite well, and they work sort of in a sector by sector and regime by regime type manner. So I think it could be done. I think it's more of a question of, well, are they doing it, or are they allowing anyone to access the data to be able to do it? So I think that's been a challenge often in Brazil. So I think, Bernarda P actually put a question in the chat, and, he seems to be very skeptical of sort of the ability to use this gap analysis in the current Brazilian system. But I think, Professor Pierre Pascal will probably have something to say to that. On tax administration, only one quick comment. So the paper cites a quote from Knossen, which talks about, tax administrators spending time monitoring lower rates on so-called deserving products or sectors, imposing turnover taxes, and spending time in court because of litigation. I mean, that to me sounds like a description of Brazil, right? There was in the recent presentation in the CBS, there was this issue that the contencioso, right, the amount of taxes in dispute just on the federal level, right, amounts to 51% of GDP, right? Accumulated over many years, stuck in courts, but that's just an insane number. So clearly those administrative problems that are raised by Knossen are very, very pertinent in Brazil. Now, a comment on sort of the use of this approach for the VAT reform discussion that's happening in Brazil right now, which is probably what I'm most excited about these days in this context. Now the paper raises a very interesting idea, which is that the potential revenues could be measured already sort of ex ante, trying to apply the proposed policies to the proposed tax bases using the sort of typical data in national accounts, input-output tables, even administrative data to the extent that it's available. So in a way, I think what the paper suggests, if I read it correctly, is that we can already to some extent score the policy gap that's built in those proposals. So I think that's a very, very exciting idea. I think that would be great if the people that are proposing new VATs for Brazil, or scholars analyzing those proposals, could actually give us sort of the estimate of the policy gaps, and where do those come from? What is the cost in terms of efficiency of reduced rates for different types of products, etc. So I think that's a great idea. I hope that gets picked up. I'll not be there anymore to do it, but I'll ask my colleagues to try to help with that to the extent that they can. So I'm very excited about that. So yeah, just one final point. There was a discussion in the paper, I'm not sure it came out in the presentation so much, on the issue that the VAT tends to be a regressive tax, but you're generally much better off sticking with the regressive VAT and then offsetting through progressive transfers. And that's an issue that's very pertinent to the current debate. I think the leading proposals want to do that. So, and in a way, I think the efficiency gap debate can contribute that by showing sort of the cost of lower rates, comparing that to the smaller cost of sort of the keeping the rates and the regressivity and then offsetting it through targeted transfers. So I think that's also a very very relevant contribution of this this great paper to the debate in Brazil. So those are my comments. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigada, Cornélios. Professor Pierre Pascal, antes de passar para o senhor, eu tenho duas perguntas que foram feitas aqui por quem está, né, nos assistindo pelo Zoom. O primeiro é o comentário que o Cornélios até já citou, né, do professor Benarapi. Ele cita como é difícil fazer essa gap analysis aqui no Brasil por conta da complexidade dos tributos, né? Mas ele também cita como que analisar a situação internacional é importante para o país. Então, em cima disso, ele pergunta por que o compliance gap estimado para a África do Sul é extremamente baixo. Ele cita entre 5% e 9%, segundo a tabela que o senhor apresentou. Essa seria a primeira pergunta, e a segunda também vai em torno da questão da informalidade no Brasil. Que o ouvinte, a pessoa que está nos assistindo cita é que países em desenvolvimento como o Brasil são marcados por uma distribuição de renda complicada, né, digamos assim, e uma alta informalidade. Ele quer saber como que a implementação de um IVA contribui nesse cenário, contribui para a redução da evasão fiscal e, por fim, se a implementação de um IVA teria algum impacto social. Enfim, agradeço e gostaria de passar para o professor Pierre Pascal.
Thank you very much, Barbara. I will work in reverse order to rely on short-term memory of those great comments. So, if I can organize myself. Yes, so I want to acknowledge that Mr. Bernard and I met in Brazil. I believe it was in 2008 during that visit, and we discussed getting experience at the time, and I see that he's very, very involved in this, and I thank him for the questions. He asked very good questions at the other workshops too, to make people sweat a little bit, and that's always good. Okay, so question number one, it was about I believe the compliance gap in South Africa. Very good question, and a seeming outlier. So I think what is interesting about South Africa is, unlike any other African country, I believe, they have, especially in the transition post-apartheid, they have made very significant investments in tax administration, and also SARS, South African Revenue Service. They've had very strong support from the Treasury Department, with a lot of intellectual leadership from people from within and outside. And they have, over time, at least until recently, more or less kept the tax administration politically insulated from the parliament and politicians. And so SARS, if you look at risk-based audit, all the methodologies, many of which are published on their website in English, they're really an outlier. They're a better administration than many administrations outside Africa. Let me leave it at that. So they've had a lot of campaigns of education, doing things in a way that does not penalize formalization, although, again, I want to be clear in your third question, the VAT cannot generate formalization on its own. This is a very complicated problem, which includes overall governance and economic development, but SARS has been very good. So let's take the number for what it is. No, it's probably an underestimate of the compliance gap, but in Africa, it certainly stands out, and it would compare favorably to other countries. So the informality in Brazil, how can we control the evasion? Again, this is this is a question that raises an endogenous problem. Part of that has to do with the burden of the existing system and the fact that a lot of economic operators are not opting in and they're doing things differently. And without a new VAT system like IBS or CBS up and running for at least a year, a couple of years, and without calculations of compliance gap, you can only speculate. So to base this assessment on quantitative numbers you need actually, as Cornelius pointed out, you need actual revenues to compare to the potential, and then decide what are the sectors. And if there are links between sectors, you'll see them because you can see variations in value added. So sectors that never produce any value added, those are good candidates. Ignoring refunds and mining and things like that, those would be very, very good candidates, but you need the data to do this. So the full VAT analysis for Brazil is not an instant gratification exercise. And I think one of the points that was made earlier about analyzing the current system under using a full VAT analysis, when I prepared the presentation, I considered my position a little bit. I think that's probably not a good use of time. But as Cornelius pointed out, using the potential revenue module to analyze the VAT, I think it's perfectly doable. And again, the complexity, other countries have complexities too, and the complexity is handled through adjustments and assumptions. And those assumptions are as good as the data you have, and in all analyses, you have to make that. The Canada Revenue Agency made those analyses. They made tons of assumptions. They have to, because those data are not, we're not talking about a structural scientific model where we're going to use the VAT gap analysis to forecast the orbit of a planet. This is not the kind of analysis we're in. There are a lot of dirty data at the bottom. Some are clean. We have the national accounts data. So some people have said that the VAT gap analysis has had a positive impact in some countries in getting the statistical agency to start producing better national accounts data, update input-output tables, do household expenditure surveys with more observation. I think Mexico is a good example where about 10 years ago, the expenditure survey, I believe, had a sampling of about 5,000 households, and now it's 75. Those are the kinds of examples of things that would really, really, really help. So I beg to differ. I think this is an analysis. The potential revenue part of it would be worth doing. It would be worth comparing with projections from the Ministry of Finance for the first year revenue of the VAT. That would be, and of course, first year, you have no idea. You don't know the behavioral impacts. You don't know the impact on prices and so on. It doesn't matter. All this has to be done. All countries went through the dryer when the VAT got involved. And Canada had a commission to check on excessive price increases. What do you think that commission did for the VAT? It did nothing. It was completely ineffective. In fact, the administration was overwhelmed by the much larger number of registrants moving from manufacturer sales tax to VAT. That was their problem. It was not controlling prices. And the VAT cannot do that. It cannot control prices. So again, thank you, Mr. Happy, for your remarks. I will go back to the points made by Cornelius. And I like your distinction between negative gaps and positive gaps. That's actually a wonderful idea to shed more light on this. Now, you had two specific questions about the relationship between rates and the compliance gap. I think Professor Smart a couple of days ago mentioned in some econometric analysis a positive with very small impact if you increase rates on non-compliance, but this is really, really tricky, and that's where the entire picture is very important. Without knowing the revenue objective, we don't know what those two moving parts are. Let's take the EU, for example. It would be fair to say that in the EU, you have quite a high median standard rate, partly because for a given revenue objective with so many exemptions and special concessions and all sorts of exclusions in the EU, you need a pretty high rate to raise a decent amount of VAT revenue from a narrow base. Makes sense? So it always depends, on the nature of the base. And it's clear that high rates on a narrow base with a lot of asymmetries, that will create a lot of adjustments in the economy, chasing exemptions, zero rating, exemption creep, and having special treatments, or as Arthur mentioned, micro regime. So I'm not aware, although I suspect the IMF has run its own studies, on this. And in fact, Eric Hutton confirmed to me that they now have a lot of data on all the studies, including the ones that are not public. And as part of their analyses, they have a lot of the information because they can track VAT rates. So that's, I take note of this question, and I will look into it a little bit later. Now, the second question, I think, was about the role of informality. And again, this is very, very hard to measure. But if I look at a kind of a bottom-up analysis that I typically do on mission, I'll construct the size distribution of taxpayers. So look at how much VAT is raised in different size categories of businesses. So taking the VAT registry as and I think the number we find in general, and I've had no exceptions, although most of my work is in developing countries, without exception, between 10 and 20% of the largest firms raise between 80 and 90% of the revenues. And I think what's useful about this kind of analysis is it's based on tax return data and the registry. So the data are usually pretty good. And you can have a lot of taxpayers by sectors. So you can do interesting analyses. And what's happening is, and when you look at the very bottom of this, you have a large number of very, very small businesses that contribute nothing to collections. In fact, in cases they give, there are in the public sector, there can be exemptions with credit. So they just claim and refund, they just register to claim refunds, which is completely nuts. So what we found in all those countries without exception is lopping off some of the smallest and always recommending raising the VAT registration threshold has virtually no impact on revenue. And of course, it takes education to do this because the press will see, well, that's inequitable. In one Central European country, very colorful place in terms of politics and culture. And the government promised a zero threshold because large firms said everybody needs to contribute. And I remember presenting this analysis to the Minister of Finance and his staff. No, they don't. And we look very, very large number of small operators. Sometimes some of them were small businesses with 4 employees. Why bother? It has no impact on the revenue. So what's good about an up and running VAT is the threshold is very, very important. This is a whole day workshop, but modifications in threshold or changes, tinkering in the policy rules can actually gather more information on the taxpayer population and trying to know who's under this, what are the firms that, what is the potential of the firms that are on the system. But again, I want to reiterate that the introduction of the VAT or the cleanup of the value-added tax is not a tool that can do a good job at, in and of itself, promoting the formalization or the economy, or a good tool to implement social policy objectives. It's not. In both cases, it really, really isn't. And there is a lot of literature on that. Okay, so, and again, thank you, Cornelius, for the idea about using the current system. Thank you for your support there. And that I will leave it at that. Thank you, Cornelius. And then look, go through Rita's points from the beginning. You know, I swore years ago I would never work on financial services anymore. I'm very fed up with the topic, but I can't resist. Every 5 years, I do something. So we're preaching to the choir here. There's no need to discuss further. But yes, it's doable and takes a lot of will, takes a lot of guts to do this. And you know, a lot of work on perceptions, which is, I mean, selling a VAT, that's a persuasion, that's an exercise in persuasion. It's not economics, it's not law, it's not accounting, it's not trade and industry. All those things are really important, but it's strictly an exercise in persuasion. And it's a pretty salient tax. It's very hard, very hard. So on the C efficiency limitations, I agree entirely with you. I could have done a bit of a better job. In fact, I wrote some notes for the presentation, which I didn't use, but I'm going to put them all in a small table because, yeah, the C efficiency indicator has a lot of moving parts. And that's why those comparisons are not terribly useful. You know, if you say South Africa has a C efficiency that's 8 times Niger, okay, makes sense. There are a lot of good reasons why, but when you're comparing countries that are fairly similar and you're trying to track over time, there are limits to that. That's one of the reasons, I think, why under the leadership of the IMF, why the VAT gap analysis is that you could start tracking the erosion of C efficiency over time and distinguish between compliance gap and VAT gap. So I will certainly add a little bit more. Now, on the performance indicators, this is not a message I wanted. The message that, for example, incentives to auditors and inspectors to raise revenue, I don't think this was my purpose in the paper at all, and I didn't want to touch this kind of issue. And I think maybe you're thinking of TADAT too, as you score tax systems and you see how you can improve compliance in separate sectors. I agree, this raises a whole host of problems. Now, I was more thinking in terms of tax administrative performance with targeting of resources and improvement in methodologies, using compliance gap as a guide, estimates as a guide, and also, you know, relying on other standard things like improved information systems and you know, training for inspectors. I remember visiting a country in East Africa in 2007 that had been through a civil war, and went to tax administration. Every office was full of papers. There were no computers anywhere in the tax administration. How do you administer a tax that way? So good point, but this was not the message I wanted to, and I agree, this is highly problematic, but that's another paper, which you're writing, I believe. Yes?
I wrote a paper about what I call selective law enforcement. I'll send you the paper. You can't hear me? Sorry, I was saying that I wrote a paper called selective law, and it discusses this issue of maximizing revenue. Can you hear me? Okay. I'll send you the paper.
That's not a good economic objective. I agree that I think there are a lot of other things that are important. There was another point about the geographical limitations, the limit of gap, and of course those are really, really important when you're talking about regional offices with no resources, with rural areas with large agricultural sectors, a lot of cash trade, non-tradable services. Obviously, those are really, really important. And that's part actually of the exercise of improving resources for tax administrations, you know, with better regional offices. In some countries, the developing world now, you have medium and large taxpayer units in rural area or economic regions that are away from the center. Even Cameroon has been thinking about this. I was there a number of years ago, and that's an interesting place. Very complex environment. Okay, and I think there's a point about so improving fraud evaluations of fraud, and point well taken about combining some of the ideas in Mike's paper and Archer's paper. Obviously, those papers are part of the picture. They're quite important. And I will say a word is, again, a comment that was made about customs. This is not 100% compliance at customs either. Far from it. So very interesting other papers in there. I think I've run out of points to make. So I think I will stop there and I will give Barbara the microphone back. Thank you again, everyone.
Muito obrigado, professor Pierre Pascal. Eu vou passar agora para Rita e Melina para fazer o encerramento. Obrigada.
Obrigada, Bárbara. Cabe a mim então fazer as penúltimas, não as últimas, as penúltimas considerações finais. Portanto, e com isto acabamos os seminários. Agradecer mais uma vez ao palestrante de hoje, ao professor Gendron, ao nosso debatedor Cornelius, e de fazer em geral um agradecimento à FGV, à logística da FGV, que tem sido absolutamente extraordinária durante estes seminários, e agradecer à Bárbara, que tem dedicado, este é o 6º dia em que a Bárbara está aqui connosco, a ouvir sobre impostos. Isto requer uma dedicação jornalística que não é comum. Portanto, agradecer muito à Bárbara por ter feito este trabalho. Em meu nome, da Melina, do Isaías e do Eurico, muito obrigada à FGV, muito obrigada à Bárbara, muito obrigada a quem falou hoje, mas também a quem falou nos outros dias. Estamos todos muito gratos. Dizer também, antes de passar para a última palavra para a Melina, porque ela é brasileira e eu não sou, e portanto ela tem o direito de dizer a última palavra, dizer que isto é tudo, esta é a minha última presença no Brasil, virtual no Brasil, pelo menos pelo mês, parte de férias este fim de semana e, portanto, não vou estar a acompanhar as últimas discussões. Isto são as férias da Europa. As férias da Europa começam agora, não é? Agosto, a Europa fecha e, portanto, eu vou fechar também a loja com o resto dos europeus e, portanto, vou ficar fora, vou ficar distante, mas vou ficar a torcer muito para que a reforma avance nestas próximas semanas, neste próximo mês. E espero estar com vocês outra vez em fins de agosto, ou princípios de setembro, quando o novo ano começar para os europeus, e nessa altura espero que já tenhamos uma reforma tributária já aprovada, ou quase a aprovar, mesmo assim à última, e vou ficar a torcer muito para que isso aconteça e a seguir os desenvolvimentos no Brasil. Obrigada a todos, pessoalmente agora, em meu nome só, obrigada a todos pelo acolhimento e pela simpatia que sempre me dedicam quando eu estou no meio brasileiro. Um grande beijo.
Bom, também gostaria de agradecer imensamente a todos os 1.121 inscritos, somente pelo Zoom. A gente não tem o número certo de todos os dias das pessoas que assistiram pelo YouTube. Então, foi um imenso sucesso. Queria agradecer a todos que assistiram esses 6 dias. Igualmente agradecer aos organizadores, a professora Rita especialmente por dedicar todo o seu tempo na organização, estar aqui todo dia com a gente, e a professora Eurico e Isaías, que obviamente estão acolhendo esse evento, essa série de webinars dentro da FGV. E desde o início, quando a gente começou a organizar esse evento, o nosso principal objetivo era trazer uma discussão internacional bem aprofundada, papers de professores reconhecidos internacionalmente, porque justamente nós temos uma literatura sobre VAT consolidada internacionalmente, e essa literatura tem que ser conhecida no Brasil. Nós não podemos inventar a roda, criar mais jabuticabas que só existem no Brasil. A gente precisa trazer essa experiência internacional. É muito importante, obviamente, como a Rita sempre fala, levando em consideração as características do Brasil, mas nós não podemos desconsiderar toda essa discussão internacional, essa experiência internacional, e por isso a gente é extremamente grato, nós somos extremamente gratos por esses professores virem aqui, exporem seus papers, a sua experiência, compartilharem conosco todo o seu conhecimento, e especialmente Pierre Pascal, que acompanha todos os dias as nossas emissões, está muito interessado na reforma tributária brasileira. Espero imensamente, assim como a Rita tem colaborado muito, espero também que você, professor, continue nessa discussão com a gente, porque acho que a gente precisa muito, muito de ajuda internacional, sim. Nós não podemos deixar de lado essa discussão internacional. Isso que eu quero passar, e esse foi nosso intuito com esses seminários. Então, eu queria agradecer novamente o Cornélios, a Rita, a Bárbara, a equipe da FGV que está aí por detrás da organização desse evento, a equipe do NEF, o Rodolfo, a Laura, a Lina, e todos que participaram durante esses 6 dias. Espero que seja só o início de outras discussões a respeito do IVA, que está para ser, do IBS, que está para ser implementado no Brasil. Então, muito, muito obrigada e até a próxima.